I don't understand how you have shower sex. Like, I literally, like, from a physics standpoint, from just everything, how the fuck does that work? Unless you're doing it and you're standing and you're doing it from behind.
Yes. Very good, Lauren. You just did the thing that AI cannot, which is to go from one gear to the next gear. But like, okay, so, sometimes it feels kind of hard to just come on here and talk about heavy stuff all the time. But we're still going to talk about heavy stuff today.
Hey guys, welcome back to What They Don't Say. Today, we are going to be diving into some super fun topics, looking at all things that have to do with sharing your story.
And this is all thank you to a listener that wrote in and wanted to hear our thoughts on it. So we're just going to be kind of talking about like what it means to share your story, how do you do it, some things you need to think about.
So if you're someone who has been kind of considering whether you want to share your story on a bigger platform, social media platform, Instagram, whatever it might be, we're hoping that we can kind of talk through some of those thought processes and things to consider and help you guys make that whole process just a little bit easier.
We had a write-in from a listener, and it was from a man, and he was basically saying, it'd be really interesting for you guys to kind of talk about, what does it look like when you share your story on social media or just with the public, and how sort of like there can be retaliation aspects to it. It can just be scary in general, but like a lot of people feel that after they've experienced some form of sexual violence or sexual assault that they're kind of compelled to share their story, whether that's because they've read or heard other people share their story and it helped them, or sometimes just this idea of like getting this awful experience like out of your body and like letting people know you went through this can be something that can really help with the healing.
I think that there's like, there's a difference between going to the people that you trust and like people you're closest with who, will support you, like your family and friends, hopefully, and telling them. But I think it's a whole different thing to open yourself up to the world, right? And like this can do with, I just want people to know that this is something that I've been through. It can be a form of justice for some people. Maybe it's you just want the name out there so that other girls like are warned by it. I think that's like something that's pretty common. I've seen in like undergrad, like girls would be like, this happened to me, like this guy, this frat house, like, like as like a warning. But I think that like before we kind of dive into all these reasons and kind of just like why people might do this, the options of doing it, things like that, like I think it's a good idea to talk about our own personal experiences and just kind of go back to, talking about like sharing that to the people you're like close with, what that felt like, and then kind of moving into this space that we're in now of like, yeah, like we're just going to talk about this shit and open it up to anyone who wants to listen. And that includes like posting stuff on our social medias, like not just on the What They Don't Say Instagram, but also like our personal Instagrams. I know for you, Shannon, like there was this like point where you were like okay with sharing it on a bigger platform, maybe that's social media, whatever it might be. So maybe could you talk through like, what were your thought processes? Were you feeling like safe within doing that? Like, were you worried about anything? What was kind of going on in your head?
A few months ago when we started this podcast, I like knew eventually that I would have to kind of post about it on my social media just to be like, hey guys, I did a thing, like, reaching out to your audience that you actually have already. And I never really thought that would be like that. Like I was more scared to say that I had started a podcast than I was to say than I was to announce to the world, oh, I've been sexually assaulted. And about like a few hours before I made that first initial post to go on my story, I was like, oh my gosh, people from my high school that aren't necessarily super fond of me are going to know I've been sexually assaulted. People that I haven't talked to in a long time are going to know. Maybe people from my work are going to see that I've been sexually assaulted. And it was this thing of like a big fear of just people either not believing me or wanting to blame me, or just kind of like honestly just thinking it was like weird to make it like, I was worried that people would be like, oh, this is her whole personality now. Like she's the girl who talks about sexual assault, instead of just like it being about me sharing my story with you on a bigger platform. Mm-hmm. So that was scary, I would say. But I also was able to lean into this understanding of, we already had gone through the court process. So I wasn't afraid of any sort of retaliation because our perpetrator's in jail, right? Now, that doesn't mean that his family can't see it or that his friends won't see it, but it's just like I could lean into that as a reassurance. And also I leaned into a lot of this idea that as scared as I am, like I need to push through that so that we can reach a bigger audience, so that we can try to make a difference. And so that was sort of the key thing for me. But from the perspective of just like sharing it on social media without having had a court case, like that isn't something I've experienced. And I can imagine it would be particularly scary. Because you also posted it on your social media too. So like, how did you feel? Were you worried about the message? Were you worried about people judging you? Like, how were you feeling with all of that?
Yeah, well, I think that like kind of goes back to what we talked about in our last episode, like labeling and kind of what you just mentioned. Like, you were like kind of nervous about how people were going to view you when you posted this and like kind of announcing that. Like, I know you didn't like straight up be like, I've been sexually assaulted, but putting this podcast out there, you know, people are going to assume, even if they don't listen to it, like, oh, this has happened to her. And for me, that was kind of like that same idea of like, oh, like, I don't want to be like labeled the girl that was sexually assaulted, or like just have that become this bigger part of my identity than I feel like it is. And so like, I think that was like a really scary thing for me. I also like, I think that there are definitely people for anyone, people that like might follow you on Instagram or like whatever social media platform, and you know, you don't want this to be shared with them. Like, they don't deserve to know what you're up to or what you're doing. And so that was like a thing for me of like, I didn't like block anyone from like my stories or anything. And I know that you did, which is totally fine and totally valid. But like, I like, it's not like there's anyone who, if they saw it, it would be like actually problematic. But so for me, that was like scary of like, yep, just anyone that follows me can see this and they're gonna know. We definitely like know some people in our lives who like have had, I guess, like some pretty messed up views of like sexual assault and just like kind of worrying about what they think or like whatever it might be. So I think there is that fear of like being judged, but I like want to reiterate this, like anytime you put yourself out there, people are going to have some sort of opinions, but like honestly, who cares? Like
they also might not even say it. That's the thing, is like if one of your followers like sees you post about this and they judge you, but they don't take the time to like learn your story, learn how this affected you, and they're just sitting there blaming you or not understanding, then like that's on them. Like if they don't believe you, then that's fully on them, and like you have no control over what they think. And so hopefully people won't, you know, actively say you're lying, this isn't true, or have any sort of like hate comments, retaliation and sort of things.
But I think that's like the biggest thing, right? Is that like you aren't in control of what other people think. You can't change that, and you can't like probably change their opinions. And so like you have to like remind yourself, and like I remind myself of this, if something is stressing you out, but there's nothing you can do to change it, you are not in control of it, like you gotta just like let that go. And I think that is like a huge thing for this case. And you also have to remember that like the majority of these people, they don't know your fucking story. They don't know the full thing. They don't understand what happened to you. Like they will never understand what happened to you. And yeah, so maybe they're forming some fucked up opinions or even commenting some shit, but you have to remember, like, what the hell do they know? Nothing. So like how, like their comments or those opinions, like they don't hold any fucking weight because they don't know the goddamn truth and they don't know your story. And you have to remember, like, you have the power, and don't give those people the power.
Right.
And it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to do that because like when people are mean to you, like that sucks. Yeah. And there's like no easy way around that, but you just have to remember that like you hold the power in this situation, not them. And you're not going to let them take away your narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of with this idea of the fear of people commenting, let's rewind a little bit to like, okay, let's say you've been through some sort of sexual assault, sexual violence, and you're considering posting about it or doing some sort of public speaking engagement or writing an article for something. And you're in that stage of like, do I do it or do I not? And we did a little bit of research before this episode, kind of thinking about what sort of questions you need to answer prior to putting your story out there on any channel or any media. And so I think the first question that you should ask yourself, if this is something that you're considering, is why do you want to put it out there? Like, what are your goals? Which we had sort of mentioned earlier. It's this idea of, is your goal to just get it out there? Is your goal to help someone else? Is your goal to try to gain support from other people? Why do you want to put it out there? And it doesn't need to be some big thing of like, my goal is to change the whole world. It can just be as simple as, I just want to share my story and I want someone to listen. Like, that can be it. And that's okay. So that's sort of like the first sort of question you need to ask yourself. So sort of an example of this, we're just going to kind of use the podcast because that's the only way that we've posted about it on social media and talked about it. But so like, why did we, Lauren, decide to share on social media?
I think like the biggest thing was for us, we want to be able to help people. And because we both have gone through this and we've also gone through a court process, we've gone through like these healing processes and just like the day-to-day of something like this happening, we recognize how common this is. But we also recognize how uncommon it is for these conversations to be had. And so I think that like the biggest thing was like, let's just start a fucking conversation and whoever listens. And if we help one person, that's awesome. Or like if we give like one person a piece of advice that they use in their life, like that's awesome. So I think that like that was kind of the driving force for us. On a smaller scale, like I've shared my story at like my undergrad institution because I was like working for the Sexual Assault Prevention Center. And because I shared that, like a lot of people came up to me and like shared their stories with me. And like that was like honestly like a really, really cool moment where like we got to connect and have like these conversations and just, they talked to me about their struggles and like how, maybe they like asked for that person to be removed from like a classroom or a dorm room and like it didn't happen, and kind of just their frustrations and also their frustrations with the lack of like digestible resources that are out there, which once again is another motivation for why we wanted to share this.
And something that, we haven't done is we haven't just come on here and given a detailed account of our assaults, right? Like we've been doing it in smaller pieces. We've talked about the aftermath and the beginning of the court process, and we've shared it in pieces. And so with that, when you're considering sharing, like how much of your story do you want to share? You don't have to share every single nitty-gritty detail. You can if you want to, but if you just want to say like, hey, I've been sexually assaulted and like #MeToo, great, cool. That's totally fine. But so it's up to you what you are comfortable with sharing. And before you do share, you need to figure out how much do I want to expose to the world? Like if you wanted to give a sort of like a fairly detailed account of what happened to you on an Instagram post, think about how would you feel, like really put yourself in that mindset of, okay, I just clicked post and now all 800 of my followers are going to see that. How does that make you feel? Does that stress you out? Does it make you feel empowered? Does it make you feel nervous? And so sort of explore that with the how much of your story do you want to tell. Another thing that I think can be particularly scary, and we're going to get into retaliation stuff in a second, but is like, do you want to share the name of the person who did it to you? Do you want to share the organization that they're a part of? Are they a part of a fraternity? And notice that we haven't shared the name of our assailant on here. That doesn't mean we won't at some point, but that is something to consider.
I think for us, because we did this after our court case, there can't be any legal repercussions as long as we're using like the facts of the case, right? So because our assailant, was found guilty and is in prison, in theory, like we could come on here and say his name because there's not going to be, you can't like file a suit for slander or for what, like.
I've been worried about that. I've been thinking about that. Sometimes I wonder. I guess we'll find out. But the point is that we're not actively in a court case. So like if we had said something on social media that was different than how we testified, then like that could be something that could be brought into that formal process of litigation.
Yeah. So you do have to be aware, like if you are planning on pressing charges or if you are going through a court process, you do want to be very careful with what is said, because anything that's put out in the public like that can be used in a case. And like Shannon said, like if you are spelling out facts that happened to you and then for some reason you say something a little bit different when you're testifying, they will use that shit against you, even if it's like the smallest change of detail. And that's like so stupid and unfortunate, but it's just like how it is. So like if you are pursuing legal route and you do want to like post about it on social media, just be very cautious of the things you say, using people's names and the details you give, because, you know, you don't want to see that be used against you in some way when you were just trying to like speak your truth and like tell your story. Because unfortunately, like that's just, you know, our justice system is fucked up. With that, I think that there is that whole question of like, oh, like, do you say the name? And I think there can be like pros and cons to that. Like for us, like right now, we just don't feel the need to. I mean, it's in the news. You know what I mean? Like, yeah. If you just like
if you dug enough, you could find it.
If you dug enough, like you could find it. I think that like we just like don't want to take away from like our story by like putting more focus on him, if that makes sense. But I also understand that like it might make sense to say the name, especially if you're in like a smaller community, institution, college, things like that. Like you want to protect other people from this happening to them. And if they know that that is someone who could potentially be dangerous, then they're more likely to like stay away from that person. And that happened a few times, like when I was an undergrad. And it was a good thing because then like girls stayed away from like the frat it happened at, or like whatever it might be. And so there is a value in that. But just keep in mind what your context is and like what is going on and how you're pursuing justice, and just like be careful with that, I'd say.
Before we fully went like the Air Force Academy route for the court martial, my family and I had met with an attorney just to sort of get like just some basic legal advice. And one of the things that he said was either delete or make all of your social media private until the court process is completely over. Like I made Venmo private, I made Instagram, Twitter, like everything that I could possibly make private, I made private. I was super careful about who I even let be a follower on Instagram during this time because, you know, there's been cases where people have made inappropriate quote unquote tweets or something like that, and it's ruined a case. It might not even be directly related to, you know, what the person is on trial for, but all of this stuff does have a piece of sort of your character, right? You know, you have character witnesses that come about, especially for this scenario. And so, you know, if you're going to be speaking out about this during some sort of court trial, just be, or if you're considering a court trial, be extra mindful about it, because it would just really suck to be going through something like this and have something that you know, put on Twitter be something that took down your entire case when you're trying to get justice.
They also tell you those things about your social media because people are going to try to find every excuse to tear you down as an individual and call you a slut, like especially like if you're a woman. And so it's a super interesting, like social media and the justice system, like it is honestly fucked up because like, you know, like as a girl, if you post like one bikini photo or anything like that, then they will use that as an excuse to like basically call you a whore on the stand. And that's so stupid and that's so unfortunate. I mean, like, fuck the status quo. Like, fuck it. Like, it's so stupid. And I really hope that, like, you know, like part of the reason we have this podcast is so that we can start changing these conversations because they're so stupid. But like, you know, unfortunately, we have to keep that in mind. And I know it's dumb. And like part of me, like the whole court case wanted to just go against that and just say fuck all and be like, this is who I am. Suck a dick, but like you can't.
Yeah, because the system isn't changed yet.
Yeah.
And or even like if you're someone who parties a lot, like you're a guy and you have a bunch of pictures with beer and you've been assaulted, they're going to be like, oh, well, he drinks all the time, like, so he totally could have been assaulted. You know, there's just a lot of things that can be perceived or taken and twisted when you just wanted to post a picture of your friends at a party. So moving along from there, another thing you need to consider with all of this is, will you put yourself or your family or your friends in a dangerous position? So is this individual particularly violent? Are they someone who, you know, has a lot of anger issues? Would they maybe not necessarily retaliate against you, but if they're in a position of power, would they retaliate against, you know, your friends or something like that? And, you know, there's scenarios where you don't know if someone's going to retaliate or not. But once again, it's something you need to think about before posting. And it sucks. Like now that I'm like sitting here thinking about all these questions that you need to think about before this, like it's so sad. But at the same time, like sexual assault is a violent act. And if you're going to talk about it, you want to do everything to protect yourself and, you know, keep yourself and your family and friends out of harm's way.
To kind of reiterate the point, like sexual violence it's a form of violence. And so you do have to be careful when it comes to that. And like, honestly, sometimes you're like, I know this person would never like, you know, hit me. Well, actually, maybe you don't know that. I don't know.
It's true. It's hard to really know.
It's hard to really know. And especially like when we're talking about like women being assaulted specifically, a lot of the times like men are stronger. They do have that position of power over you. I think that like there can be that fear of, well, maybe you knew them and so they know like where you go and what you do, and like what if they just like showed up and like even just like verbally threatened you. Like that can be like really, really, really scary. Or even like even threatening you over social media can be like really scary, because even if it's just a threat, you never know when that could become real. Honestly, like that's just like one of those things where it's like, if for some reason like you did post something and then after the fact you were concerned about any violent threats or violent actions, go to the police or like do like say something. And like I don't know how much they're gonna help you or not. Like God forbid, like, you know, hopefully they do. But just so that like they are aware and maybe like could prevent something. Or like I know some cases where there were threats of violence, so they had a police officer like outside their house like during the night or like whatever, just to like give like some sort of protection. That's like really, really like more extreme cases. So like it's just hard because you do really like just never know like what a person is capable of and what they might do. And like, you know, if they assaulted you, who knows like what else they'd be willing to do. And especially if they think that like their freedom is at stake, or they're like just how they like
their reputation,
yeah, things like that. So it is tough and it is scary. And like I know you, Shannon, like when you pressed charges, like you were worried about that.
I was super scared. Yeah. And it was a big push so that I could get a military protective order. I mean, I've never been on the other side of this scenario. And by other side, I mean, like, I've never assaulted anyone. But, you know, someone can be a rational human being. But like you were saying, once people realize that their freedom is at stake or their reputation, especially for something with such a weight, such as sexual assault, then they like that might sort of
set them off in a way
that might set them off. That might scare them. And it might make them want to scare you away from, you know, doing anything about it from a legal perspective. But yeah, I was really scared because although our assailant like wasn't named until like right before the court case happened, it was still this fear of, you know, he knows where I ice skate. He knows where I go to church. He knows where I live. He knows what sort of car I drive. He knows what my parents do during the day. Like all of those sorts of things that it would have been very, very easy for him to get angry, to show up at my house, to show up at church, to show up at skating or where I work out when I'm like alone walking to my car at night. And eventually I like had asked for that military protective order and it was super hard to get. Like, I'm not even sure if I ended up actually getting it. I'm pretty sure I did. Like, I'm like pretty positive, but they had this whole thing of like, you need to prove that he's actively violent. And I said, well, he like raped me. So I'm pretty sure that's okay. But that wasn't enough. Like they needed to know for sure.
Which is like crazy that that's not enough. Like,
yeah,
how is that not enough? You were completely violated and you were abused and assaulted. How is that not enough for them to put a protective order? Like that to me is so fucking stupid and just shows a lot of the issues that we do have in our legal system. Like that shouldn't happen.
They said that you needed to prove that he was an actual current danger to society, which was interesting because
I love the word actual. Like, oh, we know that he raped you, but like, is he an actual current threat to society?
The current threat, yeah, it was
like, honestly, yeah, right now he could probably be raping another girl.
Well, so that was the interesting thing is, so like I would get a lot of, you know, kind of random updates like, oh, we found that there was another girl who he assaulted. And like I would get a call like that, you know, every few weeks or so. And after that, I'd be like, oh, so does that mean my military protective order went through? And they'd say, no, well, this assault happened a while ago. And I would just be like, okay, well, if they won't put the military protective order through because he's quote unquote not a current danger to society, but we're finding that more and more women have been assaulted by him, doesn't that prove that over time he's been a danger to society? So therefore in the future it could happen again. It was a weird thing, but long story short,
a pattern. So what's to stop him from doing it tomorrow or next week or like whatever it might be? Yeah.
And another thing that they had said was, well, now that he's aware of all of this, like it would be a very stupid move of him to do it again while he's, you know, under investigation. And I was like, okay, like, fuck. That felt really kind of inappropriate to me. But with all of that being said, you know, that was one of the routes that I took to with the hopes that I would be, quote unquote, protected by the law more. So with, you know, that sort of fear of something, of your safety, you really need to make sure that you have a good support system, especially if you're going to be sharing this on social media or anywhere, because like you deserve to have a support system. If you are putting yourself out there, like you deserve to have people that you know will have your back throughout the fears and potentially the lows of sharing your story.
I think that that's also where like some protection can come from too. You know, depending on like where you live and, you know, whether that's like with a partner or with a family member or like with a friend, just having them understand like this is a situation. Maybe you're not worried about anything, but like maybe you also just are like, you know, like I'm just like nervous. Like I'm nervous that this person's just going to show up somewhere and like, you know, like, or maybe it's like, you know, like I'm going to the grocery store. I know it sounds silly, but like, can you go with me? You know what I mean?
Like check my location while I'm there.
Or or like, you know, like I have to go out to my car. It's like down the street though. Like, can you just like walk with me? Like that is not irrational. And that's like not like a weird thing. And like, you know, speaking as someone who like when I was younger, like I was stalked and like, even though there was no like physical violence, like that to me was like really, really scary and felt really, really threatening. And like, even now, like that like still like sits with me. And that sat with me while we were like, when we started pressing charges, like when we like went through everything, like I was always like looking for his car.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
The car thing.
And every time I saw like a white Toyota Tundra truck, I would get so nervous because I was like, oh my gosh, he found me. Like he like, even if he like isn't gonna like get out of his car and say anything, like he's just like trying to scare me or like whatever it might be. And like that's real. You know what I mean? And like those are like real fucking fears. And so like I think like that can be attached whether you like put it out on social media or not, you know? Like that's just like a real thing that people go through and people deal with. And, you know, whether it is just like a tweet or a whole case, you know, like you have every valid reason to like have those fears. And it is important to like share those fears with the people that you're close to, because living in that isolation just like will make it so much worse.
So as we had mentioned earlier, someone had wrote in kind of sharing a piece of their story. And one of the things that they had said was that he had posted on social media about his story and that the girl who assaulted him and all of her friends retaliated against him. And now he didn't specifically say whether that was through like an Instagram post and like they were commenting on it, or if like at school they were coming up to him and saying something, but sort of like what do you do in that scenario if someone is commenting or DMing you on any of the social media platforms if you post on there, and like not the sort of supportive comments, but if there's something that are mean or aggressive or victim blaming you, you know, how do you respond to that? And I think one of the best things that you can do is to not respond, because what you said is already enough. You know, you don't need to let all of these people shit on your story and then like have to explain it over and over to them.
Yeah,
over and over again to them.
You don't need to defend your truth. Yeah.
Not at all. And frankly, like I would just probably delete them, the comments, report them. And I know it's hard because you might be sitting there thinking, but they don't understand. They don't understand. I need to tell them more so that they can understand. But they won't. If the first thing that they're responding to you when you share your story is, this is ridiculous, you were drunk, how did that even happen? I saw the shirt you were wearing, like you looked pretty slutty that night, or just flat out things that are not supportive, and that's their initial response, like they don't deserve to know the rest of your story.
Also, they're never going to actually take the time to care about your story.
Yeah. So I guess if that's sort of like the retaliation on social media, you know, let's say you're in a scenario where you posted something about it or you said something publicly and you go to school with this person who assaulted you, and maybe they're coming up to you in person and they're saying things to your face and being rude or putting stinky things in your locker, or I don't know, something along those lines. You know, you can talk to a counselor about it and hopefully something will happen. You know, you don't always know. But like counselors or principals, there can be some sort of protective things or at least support so that you don't have to be walking around feeling like you were vulnerable and now people are retaliating against you and making you feel bad for it.
Yeah. And I do think it depends on like what stage of life you're in, what the situation is. I think that like, you know, if you're younger in like middle school or high school or whatever it might be, like starting with like a counselor could be a great place. I also would think like even in a college situation, like, you know, I know that obviously like my perpetrator didn't go to the school I was at, but I still like went to one of the therapists on campus and I was like, this is my situation. And then they were able to refer me to the sexual assault center that we had on campus, which was so wonderful. And the people there were so supportive and they like were able to just give me the resources that I really needed during the time. And so hopefully universities and like, you know, high schools, middle schools, whatever, are getting a lot better at this and they are able to provide resources that will help you as well as understand the threat that you are feeling and, you know, address that, whether that's like pulling them out of the class maybe that you guys share or like whatever. And I do think schools are getting better at this. I do think they are. They still have a long ways to go. Don't get me wrong, but I do think that this is a conversation that's starting and they are getting better at this. And, you know, like, I think that, like, especially in, like, at younger ages, this is, you know, bullying. And it should be treated like, you know, like, if a kid gets bullied at school, that kid gets suspended or maybe even expelled. Or maybe, like, they're, like, separated and put in different classes. Like, you know, it needs to be treated like that. You know what I mean? Like, this is a form of bullying, especially, like, at a younger age like that. Even, like, when you get older and, like, are in college and whatever it might be. And sometimes it can be like a lot more extreme than just bullying. Like maybe it really is like real fucking threats that like make you like fear a lot. So I think that like utilizing those resources and like if you don't understand what those resources are, just like start in like one place. Like, you know, that could be just like doing some internet research about your university, maybe talking to someone else who has like been through something or just like whatever it might be. It's hard and there's no like one thing that's gonna fix it and that's what sucks. You know, like you can't just like wave a magic wand and have it go away.
Ultimately, if you want to share your story on any form of platform, in any sort of, you know, paper written, words spoken, things typed, I believe that you should. And if that feels therapeutic to you, you should. There can be a lot of healing in sharing your story. But there's just some things to consider. And I know, you know, Lauren, you were saying earlier that it sucks that you have to even consider all these angles. Like you've already been in the fucking trenches. You've already been through the pain and now you're just trying to heal. And maybe this is a way that you want to heal. But there is still these things that you need to consider. And it's unfortunate, but it just is.
Yeah, I mean, we look at like a lot of other traumas that people go through, whether that's like maybe you got sick or you experienced death and you want to post about that. And like, you know, you're going to get that overwhelming love and support most of the time, right? And like, as you should. And I respect the fuck out of people who do share that stuff on social media platforms because I do think it shows an awesome strength. And it sucks that this is one of those traumas where like, you know, if you share about it, like there could be some weird backlash. And I really, really hope that one day we get to a place where like that isn't the case. I really do, because it sucks you have to consider all these things. But don't let it deter you from doing what you think is best in like sharing your story.
I think that the part of the problem and why there tends to be those sort of negative feedback things that happen is because sexual assault is usually a crime between two people and nobody else is present. Obviously, there's other sorts of scenarios, but a very common one is closed doors, two people. And so it's easy for somebody to make assumptions and think this and think, oh, well, that person, I've met them. They're so nice. They're so respectful. How could they commit a crime like this? But so that's why people jump to it so easily. Wrapping it all up, there's a resource that we found for you guys where if you want to share your story, but you kind of want some of those sort of protective measures around you, there's a website that we'll link below called herstory.org, I believe.
Close enough. We'll link
herstory.org.
You get the idea.
We'll link it. And essentially what it is I tried to create one of these websites a few months ago. Not very successful, not a great website designer, but it's really cool. So you can just go on there and you can write your story out and they will share it anonymously, either on their website, in their newsletter, on social media. But once again, it's just one of those places where you can put what you've experienced. And that can be super therapeutic or healing, or just kind of like nice to know that somebody's reading that. In addition to that, if you guys want to write in any of your stories or pieces of your stories, or, you know, even if you wanted to name the person who assaulted you just to us, we would totally welcome you to send us an email at whattheydon'tsay@gmail.com. And if you want us to read your story on here anonymously, we happily will. If you want us to just read it to know that somebody cares and that somebody is there with you and listening and, you know, comforting you from a distance, we're happy to do that. I know that it can just kind of be nice to know that somebody's there, and we're happy to be those people for you.
Whatever your preference is, like, put that in the email as well. And yeah, we'll be happy to honor that.
Thank you guys so much for listening to What They Don't Say. We hope you have an absolutely kick-ass week, and you're not alone, because we're here with you, suffering with whatever you're going through.
So are a lot of other people. Mm-hmm. And it can be comforting to know that. So yeah, we will catch you guys on the flip side.
Cheers.
Cheers, y'all.